State legislatures started granting patents and copyrights as they had never done before, and they also gave out charters of incorporation to encourage groups to build bridges and roads or to found schools, banks, and manufactories. It's not too much to say that the modern American economy has its roots in changes the Revolution brought. We instinctively appreciate those social and economic changes, in part because they remain part of our lives. We still argue about the meaning of equality. We still encourage individual enterprise. Government is another matter. The change Paine celebrated consisted in the founding of republics, governments without kings or hereditary rulers, in which all power came from the people. Today, republics are everywhere. They seem anything but revolutionary. The same is true of written constitutions, which first appeared during the American Revolution. It takes imagination to go back to a time when most of the world's people were governed by kings or other hereditary rulers, a time when no republics in Paine's sense existed, and to found one seemed a chancy gamble at best. There were, of course, republics in history, in ancient Rome, for example, but they had disappeared. That was the trouble with republics. They had a nasty way of failing. If the people ruled, the line went, who will be ruled? Republics produced anarchy. Then the people turned to a strong ruler to restore order, a Caesar, for example, or, in a later time, a Napoleon. If the founding of a modern republic was revolutionary in the 18th century, the founding of a federal republic, that is, a substantive government that incorporated a large number of smaller states, was more so. It was to do what had never been done before. And again, the issue was survival. Could a federal republic last any reasonable length of time? After 200 years of Republican constitutional government, the answer seems obvious, but it wasn't at first. In fact, the whole experiment, and that's how the founders regarded the American Republic, almost failed time and again. How did the Republic begin? Almost inadvertently in the course of the independence movement. Under the revolution principles that the colonists honored, resistance to an established government had to involve the body of the people. As a result, all the resistance organizations, the Sons of Liberty, for example, and the non-importation associations, tried to build broad bases of support. That, in fact, was the genius of Boston's Samuel Adams. He devised committees of correspondence that carried news of British actions to colonists in distant towns and drew them into the opposition movement. One colony after another followed his example. Gradually, these broad-based resistance organizations began exercising what were normally powers of government, keeping the peace, regulating trade, preventing price gouging when the supply of imports declined. After the war began, these ad hoc arrangements became insufficient. Early in 1776, both New Hampshire and South Carolina, whose royal governments had collapsed, established temporary new governments with written constitutions. They at first expected to go back to more conventional governments under the crown once the conflict with Britain was settled. But then something unexpected happened. Self-government turned out to be better than the royal government. What everyone dreaded as the greatest misery, they now unexpectedly find their greatest advantage. So wrote a group of South Carolinians only 2 months after their new government went into effect. Carolinians could choose their governors from capable men among themselves, men who, unlike the governors sent by the crown, knew the state well. Now, two laws promoted the state's prosperity, not that of the mother country. Who would go back to crown rule when they had experienced a government as the state's Chief Justice put it, in every respect preferable. What began in South Carolina and New Hampshire became universal after the Continental Congress called on the states to suppress every kind of authority under the British Crown and asked those states that hadn't already done so to adopt new governments, putting all the powers of government under the authority of the people. By the end of 1776, 10 states had new constitutions. In 1777, New York and Georgia joined the list. That left Massachusetts, which in 1780 finally adopted the last and what many regarded as the best of the first American state constitutions. Before long, some states began replacing their first constitutions, taking into consideration their experience and that of the other states. What were the most important developments worked out in those early state constitutions? First of all, balanced government. In the beginning, the states tended to center power in their elected legislatures. That made some sense. Before the Revolution, the only part of colonial government that was everywhere elected and so answerable to the people was the lower house of the legislature, or the assembly. So Americans naturally trusted the assemblies most. From the start, however, John Adams said it was dangerous to give unchecked power to legislatures because they could oppress the people every bit as much as governors or kings. Thomas Jefferson agreed. He criticized Virginia's Constitution of 1776 because it put all the powers of government, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the legislature. That concentration of power, he said, was precisely the definition of despotic government. Gradually, the Constitution separated and balanced the branches of government, and constitutions themselves began to look different. The earliest, Virginia's and Pennsylvania's, for example, just listed their many provisions, one after another, in a continuous, numbered sequence. But the Massachusetts Constitution, which John Adams drafted, was divided into articles. The first was on the legislature, the second on the executive, and the third on the judiciary. Sound familiar? You might say it's just like the federal Constitution, except that the Massachusetts Constitution came first. The states also found a way of making constitutions different and more fundamental than ordinary laws. Elected legislatures adopted the earliest constitutions and then felt free to change or ignore them whenever they liked. How could the Americans create constitutions that even legislatures had to obey? Massachusetts again came up with the answer, and interestingly enough, it didn't come from men like Adams so much as ordinary people in rural towns like Concord or Pittsfield. There, the Constitution was written not by the legislature, but by something new, a specially elected constitutional convention. Then the convention sent its draft back to the people for ratification. The Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 was therefore a direct act of legislation by the sovereign people. Its text made that clear. We, the people of Massachusetts, it said, do agree upon, ordain, and establish the following Declaration of Rights and frame of government as the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Again, does that sound familiar? The federal Constitution, of course, also begins, we the people. The Constitution of 1787 did not, however, emerge automatically from state precedents. A nation that had just spilled its blood breaking away from one central government was not ready to go out and establish another strong central government 5 minutes later. First, it adopted Articles of Confederation, which were a clear step forward when Congress first sent them to the states for adoption. They formally bound the states together in a perpetual union and made a good stab at dividing responsibilities between the states and Congress. The Articles of Confederation, however, put all power in one elected assembly. The Articles did not allow Congress to raise taxes or lay duties on trade. That meant it couldn't retaliate when other countries closed their markets to American shippers. It couldn't stop states from violating the rights of creditors, nor could it help Massachusetts in 1786, when the state's hard money policies caused the debtor uprising known as Shays' Rebellion. And meanwhile, Britain, which had never left its posts in the Northwest, was trying to make Vermont part of Canada. There wasn't sure good reason to think the country was falling apart, which was very upsetting to men like Washington, who'd spent 8 hard years fighting for the United States. His old military adjutant, New York's Alexander Hamilton, or James Madison, a short, physically unimpressive Virginian who was becoming perhaps the nation's greatest expert on constitutional design.